By the fourth day of the 1926 general strike, the mood in Britain had changed. Lines were being drawn. Violence was breaking out.
And Churchill was right at the center of the crisis.
Not just reacting to events, but shaping the story told to the nation.
This is episode 2, The Red Menace and the Blue Pencil.
Welcome to another episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Richard Toye, and with me, as ever, is the man who'd love to be British, and technically is, Dr. Warren Dockter.
And a citizen.
So we've been talking about, last time, about the first 3 days of the general strike, perhaps the most epic industrial confrontation in British history. And we know that Churchill had moved quickly to launch this official government newspaper, the British Gazette, but there were quite a lot of tensions, not only in the society as a whole, but even within the government, because some people saw Churchill as being somebody who was self-aggrandizing, who was looking for attention for himself, and was actually kind of obstructing the work of other people who were trying to keep the country going in the face of this massive industrial shutdown.
Do you think, two things before we kick off. One that I just can't get away from is that the way that Churchill's taken over the British press, in some ways, is like a moment where he can be like, it's another hat for me to wear. I've always wanted to be a press baron. A lot of his friends were press barons, and now he's kind of play acting as one. The second thing I think that's interesting, Churchill certainly has a very romantic view of himself and of the British Empire fighting off this kind of the context of Bolshevism and everything. And do you think that because he keeps framing things as like a revolutionary moment intended to inflict suffering, this must really complicate things, because otherwise it's just an ordinary trade dispute, but he's giving it this kind of romantic grand stage to happen on.
Yeah, I suppose, dealing with the first question, of course, he was somebody who was pretty good at writing, as we know, and had been successful as a journalist and continued to make large sums of money. But the fact that he was good at writing articles didn't necessarily make him a good person to actually run a newspaper. So that was kind of a different proposition. And then the second thing, there were other people in the government who wanted to obviously portray this as an illegitimate strike which needed to be brought to an end, and they would, as Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister himself, would raise the constitutional issue, turning into something more than an industrial dispute. But he was somebody who was much more emollient, who was later on in the 1930s as Prime Minister seen as somebody who was sort of appeasing Germany or failing to do enough to rearm, right? He didn't have a kind of a tough guy image. He had a more of a kind of friendly uncle of the nation kind of image. And so I don't think that he was in any way soft on the strike, but his way of being tough on it was different from Churchill's. And Churchill was trying to raise the temperature, whereas in some respects, Baldwin and others wanted to lower it.
Well, right. I want to congratulate you on your use of emollient. That was pretty remarkable. The second thing is to say, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Stanley Baldwin is the kind of like, I'm disappointed in the trade unions, whereas Churchill's like fervently working things up. And so you can see that. And just going back to my original point about Churchill play acting as a press baron, he actually moved his office into the Morning Post, right? Which was just kind of, they're going bankrupt. So he kind of commandeered it. And I think kind of turned himself into a Napoleon of Fleet Street. Now, Fleet Street, just from our American listeners, is where all the press operated out of and was kind of shorthand for the British press. So he becomes a Napoleon of Fleet Street, again, romanticizing his crazy view. And you can see that juxtaposed to Stanley Baldwin, again, who is very much like, well, we can solve this together.
Exactly. Again, I think we mentioned J.C.C. Davison, kind of eminence grise of Baldwin, kind of behind the scenes, complaining that Churchill and Lord Birkenhead, who at this stage was Secretary of State for India, but was a good mate of Churchill, quite to the right of the Conservative Party. And he's saying, well, Churchill and Birkenhead are telling everybody that they're running the British Gazette when they're not really, that they're kind of turning up in the office, trying to give orders, telling people what to do, and bluntly kind of getting in the way.
Didn't Churchill also literally like edit some of the editorials? Like he was in there like redlining stuff.
Absolutely, with his blue pencils, which was what was then used in Fleet Street as a tool for marking things up. He likes being in control of information, and he's not always totally fussy about the information being 100% true.
Yeah, and I mean, it's impossible for me not to draw this analysis from what he learned as a very young man in Cuba, which we talked about, because there he saw how the press could be used as a tool, and he talks about that in his writings. And so he got really interested, of course, in the First World War. The control of information was he was a Home Secretary, and then the First Order of the Admiralty. So the fact that he sees fudging the facts, and in one instance, to maintain morale, he started saying things like there are, of course, 200 buses operating on the London streets, when in fact there were only 86. And he claimed that there was a full service on the central London tube line, when in fact only 8 of 29 trains were working. And
He could have got a great job as a tube announcer as well.
yeah, no, that's very true. I think that that's really interesting, though, because one of the things that we know him for later on, of course, the Second World War, is he was honest in a lot of his press releases, or at least in his speeches about what was happening, even when it was bad news. And here in this instance, he's manipulating the data to serve his ends.
Well, I mean, I would suppose with the comparison with the Second World War, I mean, broadly speaking, but there are also times when he didn't mind exaggerating German losses. He didn't feel compelled to be 100% truthful about British losses. He didn't engage in total mass distortion, I would say, but he was kind of thinking it's not so much alternative facts, but that when there was a version of the facts which was kind of more positive, he'd like that one to go out and wouldn't have any truck with anybody coming back saying, oh, but hang on a minute, that's not 100% quite how things are.
Right. And so a part of that game then is not just saying yes or no, but it's about what information you do allow in. And of course, one of the things that Churchill refused to allow into the British Gazette, which was outrageous, was that there was a statement of peace written by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Churchill refused to publish it, much to the consternation of the sitting king, George V, at the time.
Yes, exactly. There's a joke which Lloyd George, former Prime Minister, makes after the strike, which is that even if Jesus himself had turned up in London, then he wouldn't have been allowed to have that reported in the British Gazette.
It reminds me of a thing that's going on today that's like, oh, if you think, I mean, I'm not going to get into all of it, but if you think the Pope is too liberal, wait till you hear about what Jesus is saying.
Yeah. Yeah, so really, Churchill does want to portray the strike as not merely something which has to be defeated, but as a kind of a potentially revolutionary threat. But we have to say also, I think, that in terms of what was going on in the strike, the workers, of course, were not passive, and that they themselves, the Trade Unions Congress, launched a rival paper called The British Worker. And so that, again, had to be improvised very quickly. They didn't have, of course, the same command of resources as Churchill did for the British Gazette. And they saw themselves as sticking to the facts and to the logistics of the industrial dispute that was going on. And it's quite interesting to take a look, for example, at the third issue of the British Worker, which comes out on the fourth day of the strike. It's headed "The British Worker Official Strike News Bulletin," published by the General Council of the Trade Union Congress. It's pretty basic, is that like there aren't any pictures, it's just text, very much like the British Gazette in that respect. Bit which you see most prominently in the centre of the paper on the front page is the General Council does not challenge the Constitution. It is not seeking to substitute unconstitutional government, nor is it desirous of undermining our parliamentary institutions. The sole aim of the Council is to secure for the miners a decent standard of life. The Council is engaged in an industrial dispute. There is no constitutional crisis. So they're heavily seeking to rebut the government line that the strike is a threat to the Constitution. And they're just saying, no, kind of ordinary industrial dispute. It is that trade unions who not, in fact, directly involved in the mining industry are coming out in support of the miners, so it's a sympathy strike, but we're not challenging the government's right to rule or saying there should be some kind of different system of government.
Well, and I think that's important because it does two things, right? One, by saying there is no constitutional crisis, it's turning the temperature down and being more responsible. It's a direct rebuff of Churchill's existential threat kind of framing of this in that kind of romantic way. Yeah. And number two, because it's not an existential threat, that means that private, behind the doors talks can take place, which in fact began when Herbert Samuel opened the talks of the Trade Union Congress and offered to be a mediator to try to bring people together and solve the problem rather than just having a kind of Churchillian face-off.
Right.
That perhaps he would have loved.
Right. So we should probably say who Herbert Samuel was. He was a liberal politician who had been in charge of the commission which had come up with the idea of the subsidy to the coal miners, which had lasted for 9 months and then run out, which was kind of triggering the strike early 90s. So he was somebody who's not really a name to conjure with today, but he was a kind of a capable politician who turns up in a lot of places throughout this period of British history.
Yeah, he was a safe pair of hands. And so you can imagine Herbert Samuel mediating between the government and the trade union workers.
Yes, exactly. And really, I think that's what the government is looking for. I mean, there are some kinds of tensions within the government. And it's probably worth saying it's not just a question of Churchill versus everybody else.
No, and I think that's important because sometimes I can frame it that way. But for instance, the Home Secretary, William Joyson Hicks, made a radio appeal basically asking for volunteers to come in and serve instead of the workers. And maybe he even saw this as something that would not be so provocative because it's being framed as an appeal, right? I don't think it was met that way by any party, but he thought that surely there must be another, he said there 30,000 men in London willing and anxious to serve their country for a few days or even weeks during this crisis.
And it should be said, of course, that quite a lot of people do come forward and that this 9-month window for a subsidy before it ran out has sort of been used by the government to make emergency preparation. So they kind of bought themselves time. And there are lots of examples of middle and upper class people engaging in strike breaking, whether it's driving trains or carrying out other public services, which sometimes in one case, people who would, driving a train and basically don't know how to do it leads to fatalities. I mean, it's really, right. Really terrible. And also it's worth saying that there is resistance to people volunteering. So we said in the last episode that broadly this is a relatively peaceable strike, but there are outbreaks of violence, including on day 4 of the strike, when there is resistance in Hull. There's a baton charge where strikers have tried to prevent volunteers enrolling at the city hall. And there are kind of other less violent episodes. And so it's treated by some people as a lark or as a jape, but there's got very serious side to it as well.
Yeah. And so from Churchill's position, I mean, he's still trying to frame it in this kind of existential threat way. And so he's doing everything he can to break the unions up, including sabotaging the British worker. And so he's trying to stop the flow of paper to them and confiscating their ink and things like that as a means to prevent them from getting their side of the story out. So you can see that it's really escalating from his perspective.
So I think that's a good moment to take a break. We'll come back in just a brief moment and we will talk about red gold.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me is Professor Richard Toye, the proletariat to my bourgeois. What? I don't know.
We're fully unionized in this podcast. So to come back to the general strike, the TUC General Council faces a really pretty awkward dilemma in that they're offered by the Soviet trade unions a huge sum by the standards of the day, 26,000.
The red gold, which you mentioned before the break. I see. Let me ask you this, just from the outset. Do you think the Soviets realized what a nerve they were pressing? I mean, they must have.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that they kind of had the emotional intelligence to spot that this would be a big problem. They hadn't expected this strike to happen. By this point, they'd got used to the fact that the TUC was rather moderate. They saw them as basically kind of class traitors, and therefore they thought it was really unlikely that a general strike would take place. When it did, maybe the Soviets saw an opportunity and had realized also that this would be difficult or embarrassing for the TUC, who was scarcely in reality their best friends.
Yeah, and you could see from the point of view that they've been trying to say, hey, this is an industrial dispute. This isn't anything. It's not a constitutional crisis. We're still British. Everything's fine. And so when the Soviet Union shows up and is like, hey, guys, here's some money to help you out, that's going to frame things as a Bolshevist plot rather than the kind of industrial dispute. And it would play right into the hands of Winston Churchill, who's been saying the whole time, hey, guys, the Bolsheviks are trying to do this thing.
Well, exactly, yes. And so the TUC reject the money. They realize that it will be terrible publicity. And then the Russians try and send another £100,000 kind of raised by a levy on Russian workers, which is kind of like really, if you're a Russian worker and suddenly you find that you're having money taken off you to pay to people who are in some ways quite rather better off than you in a long way away in Britain. Don't suppose this went down terribly well, but they obviously didn't have much choice. However, the British government blocked the transfer of this money. Nevertheless, as always, particularly during this phase of his career, he is really willing to up the ante on rhetoric, and he's saying behind socialism stands communism, Moscow, that dark, sinister, evil power, a band of cosmopolitan conspirators.
Which pulls us into the kind of middle 3 days of this strike.
Absolutely. Day 4 is when Churchill tries to commandeer the BBC, and John Reith, the Director General, is angry, regards Churchill as being stupid in his insistence that the BBC should be used for kind of pro-government propaganda. This is where Joynton Hicks, the Home Secretary who you mentioned earlier, overrules Churchill and sees it's preferable that the BBC has this nominal independence rather than following Churchill's idea that it should just basically be a mouthpiece for the government. And it's worth saying, actually, interestingly, that Reith, who keeps a diary, mentions in his notes that he himself actually delivers some of the news bulletins because although there have been complaints saying that some of the existing announcers weren't sounding confident or firm enough.
But for Churchill's point here, being rebuffed that way more or less means that he just doubles down on confiscating newsprint that had been intended for the British worker. So he's really trying to shut them down entirely, which sets the stage then, I think, for Saturday, which is the 5th day of the strike. And it's at this point that the army sets up a camp at Hyde Park and basically starts working towards besieging the docks.
Yeah, so in Hyde Park, the army, which is a large park in London, the army starts distributing milk in circumstances. Remember that this is where a lot of national life has shut down, and so they are also trying to break a blockade of the docks. And Churchill here is advocating a display of military force to overall people he calls communist agitators. So he is wanting to put on displays of force. He is clearly being really very provocative.
Right. I mean, he's literally advocating a display of military force, which feels to me like that's turning it up to 11 again, because there are elements here that are like, hey, this is just a wage dispute.
And I mean, I think that again takes us back to the question of the social drama of this. I really want to emphasize that the underlying dispute here, the miners, I mean, we've talked last time about the fact that they were having their pay cut and potentially their hours extended. This was a really awful job which people had. I think we should just stress that, because they were obviously working underground. They were at this stage generally still working with pickaxes and shovels, not with pneumatic drills. They were often not pithead baths at this stage. Those would only be introduced in subsequent decades. It's obviously filthy, dangerous work, the risks of explosions, pit collapses, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of there were these volunteers who were treating this as a bit of a game, a social adventure. But whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of the industrial dispute, these were extremely hardworking people who were having a very hard time, and upping their hours and cutting their wages was going to make their lives even more difficult from a place of already intense hardship.
I mean, the point that you're making, I think, Richard, which is a good one. And again, I'm from Appalachia, so have a deep respect and understanding of mining and its dangers. And for Winston Churchill, it means that he might get a slightly less good bottle of Paul Rocher. I mean, the stakes aren't as high for him in his class.
Yes. I mean, I think it's worth saying that he wasn't unsympathetic to the working classes in general. He did have a pre-World War One phase as a liberal where he sort of advocated for social reform. He definitely did believe in general progressive betterment and small-scale improvements, and was not absolutely hostile to trade unions. He actually tried to become a member of a trade union himself later on when he was building walls at his house, Chartwell in Kent. He tried to get inducted as a member of the bricklaying union. So he wasn't absolutely opposed to trade unions on principle, but I would say that his understanding of the lives of the lower classes was not very profound. He wasn't somebody who had to use public transport or make use of public services, or he kind of, you could say he knew a lot of working class people because they were his servants, but that was kind of the relationship, right?
Yeah, well, and I mean, you bring up an interesting thing about him using public transport, and you could see that during this strike, transport would be one of the most difficult elements of it, I think, because you had volunteers trying to operate it who couldn't, who weren't trained. Virginia Woolf noted an undergraduate driving a train without signals who ultimately broke a passenger's leg. There were 4 people who were killed. You mentioned that. I mean, think of London, right? I've lived in London. You've been to London. There are 16 million commuters in the east to London. And so the fact there's no transport really that isn't safe means that you've got complete chaos. Some people were walking miles. Some people tried to use private cars or bicycles. There basically would be no way business could be conducted, even if you were going in to try to volunteer. I don't think anyone today could imagine anything like it.
Right. And again, just in terms of thinking about trying to get the necessities of everyday life through, on day 5, there's a convoy of lorries carrying flour with an escort of 16 armoured cars and cavalry and mounted police travels from the London docks to Hyde Park. Elsewhere, some services restart, so tram services restart in Plymouth, but then some of the vehicles are attacked and tram windows smashed, and there are sort of ongoing baton charges of protesters and so on. And so you've got a very tense situation, and I think we may have mentioned it in the previous episode, but there is this famous football match which takes place in Plymouth on the Sunday between the strikers and police, with the strikers winning 2-0, and the chief constable, his wife, kicks off the match. And so that becomes the kind of the mythical emblem of the strike, which says, well, yes, there was this big thing which went, yet nonetheless, everybody was really kind of friendly, and it really wasn't revolutionary. But yeah, this thing which gets taken as a great legend of how peaceful everything was. Well, Churchill doesn't want this reported. He wants to suppress the news because he wants to be having this narrative of a kind of an impending civil war, which has to be shut down.
Yeah, well, again, that's him framing it in this existential crisis, in this existential threat. There is one more thing. We've talked a lot about the kind of violence and the riots and so forth, and the difficulties of transportation. And I just wondered, I was alive during the LA riots, and I wonder what the kind of police reaction was, because this would have been such a tense moment, Richard.
Yeah.
You've got them playing football on some hands, but also they must have been so tense. There must have been brutality.
Well, absolutely. And elsewhere. And I mean, it's worth saying that by comparison with today, when sometimes there is police violence and brutality. Nevertheless, today there will be people with phones who are recording it and reporting it, and there will sometimes, at any rate, be consequences for the police who carry it out. Much less so in 1926. And you can, like, going back to an earlier episode in Churchill's career, so the Tonypandy riots in 1910, when he was Home Secretary, that is, Interior Minister in charge of the police and so forth. Again, a mining village where the level of violence is just extraordinary and would be today absolutely intolerable, with police smashing people's heads with truncheons and so on. So to bring it back to 1926, there were large numbers of mounted police galloping through a crowd in Brighton, for example, hitting women, children, and the elderly. I don't think there were nobody got kicked out of the police for doing this or got prosecuted or anything like that. And I think that a lot of people would, including probably Churchill, would have seen this as, well, this is just life and the consequences of going to a demonstration. You might get your head cracked open. And so I won't say that, of course, the people on the receiving end of it didn't think it was acceptable, but it was much less of a political problem in those days than it would be today. I mean, again, people writing about it, complaining about it, but not leading to a political action. And so if we come to bring things back to 9th of May, 1926, then we have a nice diary entry from Thomas Jones, who was a pretty experienced civil servant by this point. And he's saying that Winston was certain that 3 or 4 days of firm handling would bring the TUC to its senses. Firm handling, it could mean all sorts of things, obviously, but bashing them over the head by the police it could be seen as being included in that. And at the same time, the editor of the Morning Post, remember this newspaper, right-wing newspaper, where lots of its facilities have been taken over for kind of running the British Gazette, he's sending messages begging that Winston should be kept away from that office where the British Gazette is being printed. He butts in at the busiest hours, insists on changing commas and full stops until the staff is furious. And I mean, that is kind of real micromanagement when you're actually interfering on the punctuation. So final observation, which Jones makes, that he's trying to get out the message which Baldwin really wants to get across. And he says, I've been trying during the day to get the PM statement printed as a small bulletin to be posted up in the East End, that is of London, and the poorer districts throughout the country. He says, the British Gazette is a paper for suburbia, not for the working man. So Churchill has had this great idea for, I'm going to communicate with the public, yet his concept of how best to address the public only really works for a portion of the population, not necessarily for those people who he needs at this moment to be addressing most directly.
Well, again, and I think that illustrates his class view of Britain. He's not particularly interested in a dialogue with the East End of London. He's interested in a dialogue with suburbia and winning the middle class. And one of the last things I want to leave our listeners with is what a French observer who is watching all this strike play out said, that the British are not a nation, they are a circus. And if that's true, Winston Churchill is the ringmaster.
Which just makes me wonder who's driving the clown car.
It's somehow also Winston Churchill.
At the end of day 6 of Britain's general strike, Churchill's newspaper was everywhere.
The government seemed to be winning the battle of words.
Beneath the surface, the strike was beginning to crack.
But while many of the trade unions were wavering, the miners were not.
And the country was increasingly divided and deeply unsettled.
Next time, the strike ends.
And the consequences and recriminations begin.
That's here on Churchill, the finest half hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.